I made a mistake the other day. I opened up Instagram. I know, I shouldn't have done it. And when I was on there, I saw some of the worst advice for developers I've ever seen. It was in the form of an infographic. Now, I'm not going to shame whoever posted it because I'm sure they have good intentions, but I would question if they've ever worked in the industry. The infographic is on screen now. Basically, it's a completely unrealistic roadmap of how one would get into technology within a matter of 2 months, which is basically impossible. And what I find really annoying about it is it just says what technologies you're going to learn and on what days. It doesn't give you any reasoning why, any resources, anything like that. So as such, I wanted to give you an actual realistic roadmap into being a front-end developer, so we'll keep it specific. And at each step, I want to give you some resources to work with, some free, some paid. But what I'm not going to do is to tell you how long each step should take, because everyone's life is totally different. Obviously, the more time you can dedicate to this, the better, but this is the real world. I learned to code while having a full-time job. Chances are you are as well. So I'm going to give you 5 steps and some optional extras at the end. Following these steps should give you the skills that you are required to have as a junior front-end developer. What is a front-end developer? Now that's a longer conversation, but more or less anything that the client interacts with, so the end user interacts with, that's what the front-end developer handles. I recommend people get into front-end development if they're not sure what they want to do, but they know they want to be a software engineer. The reason for that is there seems to be more junior front-end roles out there. It's easier to get into it as a self-taught developer because you need less knowledge of data structures and algorithms, which are more likely to pick up from a comp sci background. It's also far easier to work on impressive, commercially ready projects by using back-end as a service tools like Supabase to handle the back-end. Remember, the ultimate goal here is to prove your skills in a commercial capacity, and the only way you can do that is by building commercially ready tools. Step 1 will be by far the quickest step of this process, and that's to learn HTML, hypertext markup language. My advice here is incredibly simple. Just go on this website called Free Code Camp. It will explain all the details. The very first few lectures will take you through how to use HTML. This is what the vast majority of self-taught developers do. I'm not going to labour too much over this. Just make sure you understand what all the main tags are, what they do, and why you'd use them. Step 2, let's talk about CSS. This is where things get a little bit more complicated. Now, I genuinely think the biggest mistake aspiring front-end developers make is not concentrating enough on CSS. It really does represent a huge amount of what you do in the real world. In terms of resources here, I obviously still recommend Free Code Camp, but my favourite CSS resource is a website called csstricks.com. There's also 2 games to help you practice 2 really fundamental concepts of CSS, those being Flexbox Froggy and Grid Garden. People often ask me when should I move on from CSS, and I would say there's a fairly simple framework actually to know if you're ready to move on. Do you truly understand the box model, flex, and grid? If you do, it's probably time to move on. I would also recommend building one fully fledged project using both HTML and CSS. It doesn't have to be anything overly complicated, but once you're outside of the web-based environment, so you're doing something in an IDE, that's how you know that you're advancing a little bit. Make sure you've downloaded something like VS Code to work in, because I do think that's one of my biggest regrets, was staying on web platforms. Step 3, and I think this will probably be the bulk of your time learning, and that is to learn JavaScript. Notice I say JavaScript. I'm not talking about any frameworks here. Please don't rush into learning a framework. If you've never had any kind of exposure to programming, this is the most likely area to trip you up. People who've checked out my content before may be aware that I failed learning to code twice. The first of those failures came when trying to learn vanilla JavaScript. I'd stopped doing maths past the age of 16, and I had a business degree, so I'd really had very limited exposure to programming. Therefore, a lot of the logic was quite tricky for me to understand. Doesn't mean you can't do programming if you don't know anything about maths or you've never done any kind of programming before. It just means that this is probably going to take a little bit longer because you need to learn to think like a computer. It's not even so much about learning the language itself, it's more about learning how to think. In terms of resources here, obviously I still recommend Free Code Camp. I would also recommend Codecademy. The Odin project is great, and the MDN docs are basically the best in the business. If you Google a lot of JavaScript concepts, you'll get websites like W3 Schools, which aren't as good. MDN is the absolute best. I'm pretty sure it's backed by Mozilla. I still use the MDN docs literally every day at work. With JavaScript, it can be quite tricky to know when you're ready to move on, and it kind of depends on your goals. I would say once you know and understand what all the major methods do in the MDN docs, then you're probably ready to move on. That doesn't mean you need to know how to implement them off by heart, but what that does mean is you'd understand why someone might use a map on an array. You also want to be comfortable with things like objects and arrays, as I previously mentioned, and ideally the ESX syntax, so let and const. If that doesn't mean anything to you right now, that's okay. Just make sure you make a note of it so you know when to move on. As I said, don't be afraid to keep coming back to this. You can think of the vanilla JavaScript as building foundations of a house. You're not often going to use it without some kind of framework, but once you build this amazing foundation, you can use a framework to make it even better. It's going to make learning every single subsequent framework way easier. Now, step 4, this is the fun one, and we're getting closer to job ready now. Pick a JavaScript framework. Now, I highly recommend, unless you're in some very specific circumstances, that you picked React here. There is a high number of frameworks that you can choose, the major ones being React, as I mentioned, Vue, Angular, Svelte, as well as some more challenges coming up like Quick, Astro. That being said, I think React is probably your best bet between balancing being future-proof and also having a strong job market. Perhaps something like Quick or Svelte becomes the dominant framework in a few years' time, but the thing is, React is so prominent in the industry today that there's always going to be React work for at least the next decade. Don't be surprised if you find React very confusing to begin with, because I certainly did. The whole JSX syntax and how it's kind of a mishmash of HTML and JavaScript was very confusing to me at first. This is actually where I ended up giving up the second time I tried to learn. Now, the only paid resource that I'm going to recommend is Zero to Mastery Academy here. I do have an affiliate deal with them, so if you want some money off, you can check that out in the description. But this is what actually got me over the hump with React. I found the course extremely helpful, and I really like the way they frame the problems and how you go and solve them. Won't labour too much over the details because you can check out their website, but rest assured, I highly recommend working with them. If you do choose to proceed with Zero to Mastery, please do use my link. It really helps me out as a small creator. And something that's also important to me is how you should build proper projects away from tutorials. And it is very difficult to bridge that gap, because think about it, if you're used to doing everything by following a process and then suddenly you have to do everything by yourself, it's very hard. It's like, imagine trying to cook when you've only had recipe books your entire life, and then suddenly you're given a fridge full of ingredients like Master Chef and you have to assemble something. It's hard, it's a huge step. In order to bridge that gap, my favorite resource would actually be Frontend Mentor. There's free and paid versions of this, but I've used the free one and that worked great for me anyway. Basically, it gives you all the elements, assets, images, etc. that are going to be required, but you need to put them together. It's almost like they've given you some specifications, they give you a final kind of mock-up of what it's supposed to look like, and then it's up to you on how you implement that. Every project also comes with a difficulty flag, so you can get a rough idea of how hard it is. Step 5, the final project plus Git. Now that you're comfortable with some kind of major JavaScript framework, then it's time to put it all into action. I recommend a flagship project. That's something that can be commercially useful, either for a consumer or a business. If you're a career changer, this is where you can have a real value add. And that's because you understand an industry that you've previously been a part of. You can devise some kind of app to make your life easier in that industry. Now, as part of this project, I want you to start using version control. That means even if you're working on it by yourself, you want to be submitting PRs, reviewing them, and everything like that. You should be using advanced Git techniques, ideally from the command line environment. A massive bonus here would be collaborating with someone. Off the top of my head, have you maybe got a friend that is learning back-end development? See if you can work together. This comes with the additional bit of showing employers that you're a team player and you can work with other programmers. Even if you're working by yourself, make sure you're using a Kanban board to keep track of the project. Write up tickets, so specifications for features or bugs that you're going to fix. I'd recommend, if you want to learn a bit about Git, checking out Git for Pragmatists. The author of it, Elliot, is actually on my Discord server, so you can ask him any questions. And now let's talk about a few optional extras. I'm not going to go into detail on these. Talk about testing. So end-to-end, I'd recommend Cypress, and unit, I'd recommend Jest. It can be handy to have some kind of CSS add-on. Remember what I said about not rushing CSS? I think it's also important that you learn the plain CSS as much as you can. If you want to learn some CSS add-ons, I'd recommend Tailwind, Sass, Style Components. They're great. I'd also recommend you get comfortable with one UI library. Particularly a lot of companies that are maybe a bit smaller will often just rely on a UI library. Some ones I'd recommend are Material UI, Ant Design, and Chakra UI. You can get really good stuff up and running really quickly with those. I briefly mentioned backend as a service products earlier as well, so I'd recommend checking out Superbase and Firebase. I'd also recommend checking out some of the full stack JavaScript frameworks, the major two being Next.js and Remix. Ultimately, it mostly doesn't matter what you pick past HTML, CSS, and JavaScript if you're trying to get into front-end development, but it's important to remember and be realistic about what the market is currently demanding. Just because a framework has a performance edge doesn't mean it's the best one to learn. The best one to learn is the one that most companies are using in your market. If nobody's hiring for the hot new framework, then to be honest, if you're a junior, it's basically a wasted skill. For example, Rust has got one of the highest performance stats of any language. and yet there's barely any junior jobs out there for it, so I wouldn't recommend juniors learn it at the moment. All of the resources recommended are down in the description. I'm going to try and create some kind of infographic for quick reference for this as well. In short, I'm sorry, but I don't think it's possible for the vast majority of people to go from no knowledge of programming to getting a job in 60 days. I don't mean to burst anyone's bubble, but I just want to give people realistic expectations. If you want to network with other juniors and have a supportive environment, you can check out my Discord and my other content as well. I know how hard it is to be a self-taught developer and a career changer, and I know the imposter syndrome that can come with it. So please do stick around for the ride. If you have any questions for me, or you want me to cover some kind of future topic, I'd love to hear from them. As a small channel, I really appreciate the support. Thanks everyone.